Mike Wise, ESPN's The Undefeated. Adam, when you see old players, former players critiquing your two-time MVP, are you amused by that, or are you bothered, or you think these guys are just old curmudgeons? And I'd like to hear where you stand on it.
I'm not bothered by it. I think they are. What I've learned being around this league for a long time is that players, even when they're current players, let alone when they're former players, they're like fans in many ways. I mean, they engage in the same discussions we all engage in. I mean, and by we all, I mean as fans, not necessarily as league officials or as journalists. And in certain cases, some of these legends played with particular players, so they feel more able to make certain comparisons. But I think, just listening to some of what Steph Curry has said, I think he has the right attitude. I think that it's different times, different approaches to the game. I think because of rule changes, it is very difficult to compare one generation to another. It's no secret that the game is much less physical, I think, for the better. You know, there was a period of time in the league when physical force was paramount in many ways, and there were more sort of enforcer-type players in the league. And when the Jerry Colangelo committee and what then Commissioner Stern was very focused on was making the game more wide open, you know, allowing these great athletes to demonstrate their skills on the floor. So I think it's what sports fans do, what journalists do. I enjoy the conversation. You know, and I think people can make judgments for themselves. I mean, clearly there's some people who weigh in who may be bitter, some not. Some genuinely have a point of view. Some are not as well informed. Some may not be watching as much of the game, but still have a view anyway. So I enjoy it.
Sixth row in the middle, Amin.
Amin El-Hassan, ESPN. How far are we from intentional foul, hack-a-shack reform?
So I think you all know it is my hope that we are not far away from some reform. This is an issue where I'm hoping we can strike some sort of a compromise. I mean, there's no doubt that there are particular teams, particular owners who have spoken out against any change whatsoever. And I also recognize from a competitive standpoint that largely 3 teams will be the beneficiary of a rule change. There's 3 players in particular, and everyone knows what I'm talking about, and whatever team they're on, if they're going to play a lot of minutes and they're poor free throw shooters, the ability to hack them away from the ball creates an advantage for the other team. What our analytics tell us is it's not as big as an advantage as some might think, but it's an advantage. And I think it's my job to look out for the greater good of the game. I think, first of all, in response to people who say, you know, guys got to make their free throws, and I was one of them. I think I acknowledged to everyone last summer that I was on the fence. What we've seen even since last year is yet a 2.5 times increase off last year of the number of these off-ball fouls, you know, away from the ball fouls, intentional fouls. And it's looking back just even at the last 5 years, it's now up 16 times from 5 years ago. And so on one hand, of course, I want guys to be able to make their free throws, but what you see is even among those 3 players who are the poorest free throw shooters of the ones who get hacked the most, something like 2/3 of their free throws still involve plays around the ball. In other words, plays that would not be impacted by a rule change. So they still have, and their teams, every incentive for them to become better free throw shooters. One statistic I find fascinating is that if you look back over the last 50 years of the NBA, average percentage of free throw shooting has remained at 75%. I mean, it's quite remarkable. I mean, slight deviations. I mean, it goes 75.2, goes 74.8, and I'm not sure what that ultimately tells you. It may say that on average, it's very difficult to improve free throw shooting, and therefore, statistically, we're always going to have some bad free throw shooters in this league. And then the question is there a compromise? I mean, in order to change a playing rule, it requires 2/3 of the teams voting in favor of it, and the commissioner does not get a vote. So all I have is sort of the bully pulpit to make recommendations to them. And part of my job, too, is not just to look at the competition, but the business implications as well. And I've said it before, but I know when for example, when the Hack-a-Shack is done something like more than roughly 10 times a game, it adds about 15 minutes to the length of the game. I mean, not only is that something that is bad for our network partners, but all the fan research we have shows that the fans hate it. You know, and so there may be a compromise in there where we can cut it down significantly. It still remains an advantage for those teams that don't have one of those players, or said differently, a disadvantage to those teams. But I think this notion that everyone's going to sit around saying the guys just got to make their free throws, what's been demonstrated over the last 5 years is not only is that not changing significantly, and there are always individual players that a team can point to, but they almost always regress back to the norm, and as one player gets better at free throw shooting, another gets worse. That's why it stays at 75%. So my view is it's not an attractive part of this game. Obviously, years ago in 1978, we crossed that threshold in terms of principle, because long before I was involved in the league, there was a rule change for the last 2 minutes of the game. So it can't just be guys got to make their free throws. There was an acknowledgement that it doesn't look good in the last 2 minutes, and it unnecessarily prolongs the game and adds an unattractive element. So now the question is, can we take that rule and maybe we don't put it in effect for 48 minutes, but we look at other aspects of the game, all, you know, as I said, moving towards a compromise to at least cut it down significantly.
Rachel?
Rachel Nichols from ESPN. Adam, I think anyone who's watched the political process can appreciate not drawing a line in the sand on the North Carolina issue. That being said, there has to be a drop-dead date for moving an all-star game. When is it?
Well, let me begin by saying what I haven't said is that we're not looking at alternatives. We are looking at alternatives. And so the critical date for us is, are we in a position, if for some reason we don't move forward in Charlotte, to play our all-star game somewhere else? We are in the process of looking at other options. At the same time, it would not be, one, I don't think it would be productive to draw a line in the sand, and we would be moving on. If I didn't think there were constructive discussions going on in North Carolina right now, you're right, why prolong it? We would just announce we're going to play our all-star game somewhere else. But that's not what's happening. And I think, as I said, people from both sides and people who have very differing views on this issue are coming together and saying, this is now an issue much bigger than North Carolina. As I said, it's going to play, at least the bathroom portion of it is going to be played out in the federal courts and by experts when dealing with facilities for students. But I think that the community is coming together in North Carolina in a very productive way and recognizing changes should be made. And incidentally, believe me, I don't want to suggest that the NBA is all important. They're doing it for their own reasons. And I think that's the way it should be, not because the NBA said, change your law, we're moving our all-star game. I know we're not that big, we're not that important at the end of the day. I think but one of the core principles, underlying principles of this league is diversity and inclusion. I think people understand that's one of our values. It was a value built from the ground floor up in this league long before I ever got involved in it. I'm sort of carrying the mantle now, but I know I speak on behalf of our owners, our teams, and our players. I think they all feel very strongly that this is a core principle of our league, and that where we choose to celebrate something like an all-star game, that those values should be honored.
So when can we look for when this might have to come to that?
You know, realistically this summer. I mean, I don't see we would get past this summer without knowing definitively where we stand.
Last question. Eighth row on the left, Ken.
Ken Berger, CBS Sports. A two-part question on the officiating. You mentioned the level of scrutiny on the officials, and the last 2-minute report is one thing, but are you comfortable with the added layer of scrutiny they're under when one of their bosses goes on national TV to sort of critique calls that may have been missed in a game without, you know, them having a chance to respond or explain themselves, or before the process has even begun? And part two, you mentioned the aesthetics of the game, how it's been reinvented. Is it possible that the pace and the force and the speed of the game has in some ways outpaced the traditional officiating techniques, and that might be a way to get that number higher than 90%?
Yeah, you know, Ken, to answer the second part of your question first, I had a team come in the other day and say we should look at a fourth official. And I think that goes to the core of your question, is maybe the game is so fundamentally different now that we do need to look at a fourth official. And so that's something, whether through our development league, you know, or summer leagues, that we'll take a fresh look at. And same in terms of techniques and training. I mean, those are things we look at all the time. We talk to the NCAA as well and international leagues to see if they have different approaches, different training. I was at Stanford University earlier on this season and looking at a virtual reality lab where they were talking about how to train officials and other people who operate in high-pressure situations, and try to simulate those situations to increase reaction times and, lower sort of blood pressure in those moments. So those are all things we're working on. In terms of managers of officials critiquing them, I would only say that everybody has their job, and I think that just in the same way that I'm put in a position to come out and defend things we do or criticize things we do, I think the officials understand that. Just to be clear, I mean, even in the case of a review, we do use a clear and conclusive standard. And maybe I should make that very clear, that when the replay center is looking at whether to decide if a call is right or wrong, it's clear and conclusive. In other words, they're being deferential to the call that was made on the floor with the recognition that video, even high definition still frame video, is not going to capture everything that happened, and that officials have other senses at work when they're on the floor. Obviously they're hearing things that may not be captured on the video. Sometimes they're literally feeling things with their bodies in terms of what's happening, and so they're trying to discern what's really happening on the floor. And so the job is in replay to be deferential, and in this case we have an NBA official, not a management person, but an official in the replay center who's working with those officials on the floor. There does come a time when, for example, with the review of flagrants, that it then becomes the league office, in the basketball operations department led by Kiki Vanderway, working together with our legal department, working together with our in-house investigators. And there, we do get the point of view of the officials. We interview the officials. We interview the three officials on the floor to find out what they were thinking. We interview the official in the replay center. And by the way, I recommend it all to you if you ever have time during the season to go out to Secaucus, New Jersey, and to sit in the replay center one night. And when the feeds start coming in, and when somebody says go, and then you have 30 seconds, a minute, and then you're hearing on the television, you're hearing your favorite commentator saying, what in the world's taking so long? Isn't this obvious? And there's 3 more feeds you haven't looked at yet. It's a very difficult job. So there's a recognition that they may make mistakes under those high-pressured situations, but in addition, we have the opportunity to interview players. So in certain cases, while there's deference to what happened, to the decision that's made on the floor, and we still use that clear and conclusive standard, based on interviews with players, they may be telling us things we didn't know, and occasionally there may be some video that's available to us that wasn't available in the replay center.
Thanks, Adam. Transcripts of this press conference will be available at Media Central. We'll also distribute to you via email. Enjoy the game tonight.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the finals.